Okay, so we're going to be talking about power, privilege, and oppression in our next session. So again, we're creating that common language, and we're starting to understand and dive a little deeper. And the reason we have to talk about these things is because as all of our folks are coming into these sessions, they're coming in with different understanding of these issues, and they're also coming in with different levels of effectiveness of systems of oppression. And so they can come into a play in all the dynamics that we have in our groups. So the first thing we have to understand is at the foundation, what is oppression? And we might have some different definitions based on our lived experiences, but oppression is the exercise of authority and power in a burdensome, cruel, or unjust manner which can result in people being heavily burdened mentally or physically by adverse conditions. Now that sounds very medical, doesn't it? Very academic, right? But what if I told you that research shows that people who are in marginalized communities, people who experience high levels of oppression, have higher levels of suicide rates, have higher levels of substance abuse rates, have early death by stress-related diseases, that they have lower access to things like fresh foods, so they suffer more from different disorders of the metabolism, right? So what if I told you that oppression wasn't just about our lived experience, but that it's actually killing people? And not just in the blatant ways we think of. Like we think about police brutality, we think about what's happening with our refugee crises, right? We think about those, but that oppression in and of itself weighs heavily on people to the point that it's actually killing people on a regular basis. When we talk about systemic oppression, this is when we need to understand that oppression isn't just all the little individual isms, right? Oftentimes we get very focused on someone who is racist, someone who is sexist. And it's really easy to get focused on those things because that's who's in the room, right? But what we need to understand is that these systemic levels have taught us these things and enforced these things. And so systemic oppression or institutionalized oppression, which you'll also hear, because there are certain institutions that reinforce these ideas. Institutionalized oppression is the mistreatment of people within specific social identity groups, right? So as we think about some of the identity groups we have up here, when we think about race, when we think about Asian American issues or Asian Pacific Islander American issues, or we think about Hispanic or Latinx issues, or we think about women's issues, specific identity groups, these systems are enforced by society and established through social norms, rules, laws, access to institutions, right? So think about who can get in the space and who can't, right? And they're done through the use of power. Systemic oppression is a matter of result, regardless of intent, right? Has anyone watched the new documentary The 13th? Where we're talking about how slavery didn't really go away, it just sort of changed, right? It's not a matter of what you meant for it to happen. It's about it's about what actually happened, right? Regardless of intent. Systemic oppression disproportionately affects people from marginalized groups, okay? In a situation of unequal power, a subordinate group has to focus on survival, right? So if your everyday existence is fighting oppression, if your everyday existence is trying to get by, you're in that survival mode, you're in fight, flight, or freeze all the time, imagine the stress that has on your body. Imagine the stress that has on your being and when you can feel free. Whether one succumbs to the devaluing pressures of the dominant culture or successfully resists them, the fact is that dealing with oppressive systems from the underside, so at the bottom side of that oppression, regardless of strategy, is physically and psychologically taxing, right? So when we have people who are coming to us for a dialogue series, we're not just talking about some distant idea to them, right? Every person in this room can talk about a lived experience in which they felt oppressed or in which they witnessed oppression, right? Imagine the weight of carrying that with you every single day, right? What that does, the physical toll. So understanding that systemic oppression, while it is up here, everyone here feels it. And the other part of that is We all either benefit from it or are oppressed by it. There is no neutral, right? There's nobody who is not affected by systemic oppression. When we gain powers and privileges, so power is innate when we have privilege, right? It is created by systemic oppression, which grants certain groups or individuals social capital. Does anyone know what social capital means? Social capital? Social capital is the fact that I've been invited to speak on Black issues even though I'm white. Because people say they'll listen to me more, right? Social capital is that as a white person, I'm viewed as an expert on race when somebody who actually lives in a marginalized racial system is not viewed as an expert on their own lived experience. I got social capital, right? If you come from a wealthy background, your opinion matters more. That's social capital, right? You have social capital that you get to push, right? And so it's all about how we use it, right? So it allows people with power to intentionally or unintentionally oppress or benefit from the oppression of others, right? So if I'm going to be a keynote speaker at a conference on race in America, I'm benefiting from the fact that a person of color who's actually being oppressed on race in America did not get that job, right? Now, that might not be my intent, right? I didn't take the job going, oh, you know what? I'm going to make sure I take all this money from them. That might not be the intent. But regardless of intent, that's what happened. I benefited from the oppression of that person. That's why when I said earlier that liberation means that our oppressions are interlinked, they're interconnected. I cannot truly be liberated if other people are oppressed. We are connected, right? Because I will always benefit from the oppression of others when it comes to race. I like this quote by Abraham Lincoln. I'm not always a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln. If you read a lot about Abraham Lincoln, you might find some stuff that makes you also not a huge fan. FYI, he actually did not have a huge problem with slavery. But nearly all men can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power. We like power. That's the truth of it, right? We like power. We like privilege. Privilege is an unearned advantage, immunity, permission, or right or benefit granted to or enjoyed by an individual, class, or caste. These categories are defined by dimensions of social identity. It's a privilege that you get just for being you, right? And we enjoy these things because oftentimes when we're enjoying our privilege, when we're walking around feeling all privileged, we don't know we're oppressing people. We have disconnected ourselves from other people so much that we don't recognize that we're actually harming others, right? So when we think about privilege, probably the biggest privilege people talk about is white privilege. We hear white privilege a lot. Can someone tell me some examples of white privilege, and you can just shout them out? Really baseline, what would be a privilege that you get for being white in America?
Not getting arrested.
Not getting arrested, right? I was just telling someone the other day, I have been pulled over and not gotten a ticket. I have been pulled over and not been pulled from my vehicle. I have been pulled over and been defiant and not been pulled from my vehicle. Right? Not getting arrested could be a privilege. What else? Base level, day to day.
Not being followed in stores.
Not being followed in stores, right? That's a big one, right? And let me tell you, I'll let you in on a little secret. This is probably going to get me arrested. No, probably won't because I'm white. I shoplifted in high school. Lipstick. And you know what? If someone had been following me, I would have been caught, but nobody followed me. I was, in spite of the fact, and this is what's interesting about privilege, privilege flies in the face of fact. We actually know that the number one group of people who are likely to shoplift are upper to middle class white women, ages 15 to 21. It flies in the face of fact. If we were following people based on fact, wouldn't that be who we follow? It flies in the face of fact. Any other white privilege that you can think of?
Sitting in class and not being the only one of your race.
Most of the time, unless you're a white person who went to an HBCU or something like that, you are not the only person of your race anywhere, not just in class, right? Another big one I tell people that a lot of people don't think about, especially if they haven't moved around a lot, I can go anywhere in the country, literally anywhere in the country, and Walmart will carry shades of everything that matches my skin tone. Walmart will always carry my hair products. Walmart will always carry my cosmetics. I will always have access to those things, right?
One time I was in, last semester I was in Asian American Studies for a class, and we talked about how Bandaids are in the color of it's like in beige, which is mostly white people use the color, so we thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The Bandaids, that's another one. Getting access to Bandaids. I'm really, 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 really white. So most Band-Aids don't match me, but they make clear Band-Aids, so I can use those. But most of the time, Band-Aids match white skin folk more than any other race. But there are other privileges. How about able-bodied privilege? Or I like to say currently able-bodied, because more than 80% of the population will eventually experience a disability. How about able-bodied privilege? What privileges do you get for having an able body?
Access to buildings.
Access to buildings, and on a historic campus, that is huge. Huge. I can't tell you how many stairs I have had to like hobble up. In my home, I'll tell you a little joke. Has anybody seen the Jungle Book? Like the original Jungle Book, not like the new one. And you know how Mowgli walks on all fours? When I have really bad flare days, I go up the stairs on all fours and I call it Mowgliing. I go yell down, I'm Mowgliing up the stairs, right? What are some other able-bodied privileges? You get access to buildings.
Free to do any kind of sports or exercises.
Yeah, so you have free access to sports, physical activities. You don't have to ask for an accommodation, right? You want to play basketball, you don't need adapted basketball. You don't need to go and find a special person who will make a special league for you to play basketball. You just get to walk in and play basketball, right?
No social stigma.
You don't have the social stigma, right? And this is particularly hard for people who have very, very visible disabilities. There's different stigmas, right? So I used to work at Wright State University. It's the second most accessible school in the country. And so it was very, very common to see 5 wheelchair users on our way to class. And so I learned a lot about disability etiquette. But what I found is that when I travel the country and I talk about disability, is that people don't know how to talk to people who use wheelchairs or mobility aids, and they look at them funny, or they don't make eye contact, or they do the worst possible thing, which is they go like this, and they're like, "How you doing?" Like they're 5, right? It's a privilege that you just get to walk through, right, and not have that stigma. Anybody else think of an able-bodied privilege?
Relates to social stigma, but being considered normal and like not being like medicalized in a sense.
Being viewed as a human being instead of a medical entity, like there's something wrong with you that has to be fixed. Yeah, that's a huge one. That you just get to walk around in your personhood, right? How about male privilege? This one sometimes makes people uncomfortable, especially menfolk, of whom I do not see many around, but still.
Sometimes job position and salary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're more likely to make more money if you identify as a man, right? You're more likely to make more money. You're more likely to make 25 cents more than a white woman. Substantially more as you go down and you look at black women, Hispanic Latinx women, right? So, because let's talk about the fact that it's not just race or it's not just sex, it's all of these things at once, right? What are some other male privileges?
Being able to sit with your legs open without getting like judged.
Yeah, that one's so basic, right? You have the subway spreader, right? You can sit with your legs open and no one's like, oh, look at them. What do we say about people who identify as women who sit with their legs open? They're loose, right? Nobody calls a man loose. That's a privilege, right? Anybody else, male privilege?
It's just like generally safer to be a man. Women are, the violence against women is a bigger problem than violence against men.
Yeah, it's a lot safer to be a man. In fact, men are much more likely to die of suicide than homicide. It's very dangerous to be a woman in the United States. And when you look globally, there are countries where it's very, very unsafe to be a woman, right? Or to be perceived as a woman, right? Anybody else?
Just like perceptions, like a leader versus like she's bossy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you get free access to power moves. That's what I like to say. Like, it's expected for a man to negotiate for his salary in a very direct way. But when a woman does it, she's asking too much. She's being forceful, right? A man is allowed to express the emotion of anger. I will never forget this in my entire life. This is a perfect example of privilege, is that I had been working with a man who lost his temper all the time. He would lose his temper all the time over everything. He would kick things, he would throw tantrums, he would call people names. And one day in a meeting, and I would express sadness. I was much more likely to express sadness or disappointment. One day in a meeting, I was talking about how sad I was over the state of the group that we were working with. And his response was, I think some people on the team are just too emotional. And I stopped and I asked him, I said, is anger not an emotion? And he said, well, no, it's not an emotion. It's not a weakness. And I was like, interesting how you've masculinized anger enough that you don't recognize it as an emotion, but that you value it higher than another emotion that you feminized, right? So there are lots of privileges we get for being male. How about straight privilege? You might hear this called heterosexual privilege. I don't use heterosexual and homosexual because it sounds like a DSM diagnostic, which makes me feel icky. But what about straight privilege? A lot of people used to jump to marriage. Now that we have marriage, people are like, what do you need? What do you want? What's going on? You don't have anything to complain about. What's straight privilege?
Being able to show affection to your significant other in public without people thinking much about it.
Yeah. You get to show affection wherever you want, and nobody's like, ew, gross, I'm going to go hurt them. I'm going to go kill them. You just get to show affection, right? So that's a straight privilege. What else?
You don't have to tell people what your sexuality is. People will just assume. You don't
Yeah.
have to like, come out to people.
You never have to come out, ever.
If you're dependent on parents or something, you don't have to worry about like becoming homeless for your sexuality.
Yeah.
You can come out to your parents.
Yeah, so if you don't have to come out, you don't have to come out to your parents, you don't have to worry about all the fallout that comes from that. And as someone who's coming from, I was director of an LGBTQ center right before I came here, I would have a lot of people tell me that doesn't still happen. And then I would tell them 37% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. 37%. When I worked at Kent State University, in one semester we had 9 students who became homeless, and we had to house them on campus and find them Section 8 housing because their parents could not accept their sexual orientation or gender identity, right? And so it's still a huge issue, the safety, right? And it's not just about money and houselessness, it's about whether you're on your parents' insurance, right? Whether your parents are paying for your education, whether you're old enough to file a FAFSA on your own, because FYI, you can't file a FAFSA on your own until you're 24. You have to have your parents' income. So if your parents refuse to provide you with your income, you can't go to college even if you're paying for it on your own. That's scary stuff, right? How about class privilege?
Just more access to literally everything because they have money.
More access to literally everything, right? You have more money, you have more power. You have more money, you have more access. You can do things, you can travel, you can have carpet. What I thought it was. I literally grew up in a family where we made $700 a month for a family of 4. Every person in my family fell through the floor of our house at least once, and we had a whole wall missing to the outside that was just covered with a tarp. And I was considered kind of good, well off for the area I grew up in. I grew up in an area where people didn't have doors to their homes, where people's entire houses were made of particle board, which if you don't know what that is, that's like where they take all the scraps of wood and they press it down into a sheet. And so the second it gets wet, it just falls apart. So they would nail particle board together and then staple tarps over it. People don't realize that type of poverty exists in the United States, because people, when we think of poverty in the United States, we think about urban poverty instead of rural poverty. But so having access to that, having access to an education, right? If you come from an affluent background, you're much more likely to have access to an education and to have access to an education free and clear, right? I owe $72,000, actually 77 now, $77,000 to Navient. I will be paying Navient until the day I die. They will be collecting, like as I go to my funeral, they'll be picking the jewelry off my wrist, like no, none for you, right? What are some other class privileges? Because it's not just about the access. What else do you get?
You don't have to worry about future debt.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about future debt. You have security and safety. What else? Going back to when we were talking about power and social capital.
In terms of like status, people might regard your opinions and
Yeah.
things you say is like more valuable.
The things you say are more valuable. Someone mentioned earlier the ills of capitalism. The ills of capitalism, I always say, and I've been told I'm a little radical for these spaces, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. Is that one of the ills of capitalism that buys into all of these things is that you are only worth what you produce, right? That's something that goes back, we talk about able-bodied privilege. You're naturally more likely to be able to produce. You will be viewed as more than, because you don't need breaks, because you don't need accessibility, because you don't need those things, right? And so all of these things, so yes, when you are valuable, you are more valued, right? And so your opinion matters more, which is why we see a lot more representation of people from upper middle class and upper class on television, on media. When we look at our celebrities, how we look at celebrity status in the United States, and everything they say is golden and valuable, right? These are all ways that we have privilege. So I want us to think for a second, if these are all the privileges, who's losing? Right? Because remember I said our privilege is intrinsically tied to others' oppression, right? And so if I'm getting all of these privileges, I'm benefiting from the oppression of others. I'm actually taking from others. And so what I like to talk about is power and resources. Because we know that power comes from resources. The more you have, the more access you have. And so if we're just talking about race on a very simplistic level, we're talking about white and black right now. And you could expand this. You could set this up as men and women. You could set this up as straight and gay. You could do all different kinds of things. But we're just talking about race right now. Some people think this is what it looks like, right? That we all start out equal, right? How many people would agree that we all start out equal, right? Nobody here really believes that, right? That we all start out equal. And so sometimes we do recognize that there are systems that come into play. So how about the historic loss of wealth, right? So that starts to push those resources down. So for example, when people, particularly for black folk who are descended from slaves, they were brought over here, they lost their family wealth, they lost their family identity, they lost everything. Then they were kept from owning property, they were kept from making money, and so there's that historical loss of wealth, whereas you'll see a lot of white families that have had money for generation after generation after generation. So there's a historic loss of wealth. We might drop in something else, segregation. How did segregation deny access to resources?
I mean, if they weren't able to access like the better education systems because they had to be at a black school which had like less funding, then
Yeah.
they automatically are set back.
So it could deny access of education to good education. It could also, neighborhoods that had more black folk were devalued because we didn't value black folk. And so your property that you paid for was worth less than the exact same property a white person bought 4 streets over. Right? So you had less access. We can talk about the school to prison pipeline that's going on here in the United States right now that disproportionately incarcerates particularly young black men, right? Denies them access to voting rights, denies them access to wealth, denies them access to an education. We can talk about the stigma of identity, right? As we talk about police brutality, and particularly police brutality against black folk, and I like to say black folk because we tend to focus on black men, but there are actually a plethora of black women and black trans folk who are being killed by police and facing police violence. When we talk about the stigma of identity, when you look at what police officers who are in these interactions say is they go back to that cultural programming and they'll say things like, he looked larger than life. They looked out of control. They looked wild. These are all really deep, socially constructed things that have been going on for decades, right? This isn't new. We could talk about mandatory minimum sentences, right? So that drugs that are typically used by black folk, there's a mandatory minimum sentence, where an even worse drug that's predominantly used by white person is getting no mandatory minimum sentence and they're walking away with a fine. We can talk about the criminalization of marijuana and how that was done, was actually taking photos of black and Hispanic and Latinx men and saying like, oh, if you let them smoke marijuana, they'll go crazed and sexually assault white women, right? All of this stuff created a really terrible social stigma around race, around particularly black folks' identities. And so then when we talk about that, some people go, okay, I get it. They start with less resources. And so we have to, give them more. We have to do something. And then people say, oh, then it's welfare, it's charity, it's affirmative action. But what people don't recognize is that this isn't what it looks like. It actually looks like this. So if I have all these things that are working like weights and plungers, pushing down on this side, it's actually pushing the resources to my side. We're interconnected. And so if we start to talk about any number of identities, you imagine that the person on that side has 4 or 5 identities in which they're feeling oppression. And so then you add in fears of safety, and you add in their sexuality, and you add in their gender, and all of these other things, and you see those resources push and push and push. This is why when we're talking about social justice, people who are benefiting from privilege don't want to recognize it, because in order to recognize it, we feel the drop. In order to truly feel liberated, we have to be willing to give up some of that space, some of that money, some of those resources, right? So when we think about all the different ways that this could work, and these are in no way specific to the person, right? But that you could have different levels of resources and how they would add up and what they would look like. And we start to get a concept of what we call intersectionality. Is anyone familiar with the term intersectionality? Know who coined it? It's actually Kimberly Crenshaw. So Kimberly Crenshaw talked about intersectionality and specifically talked about black women. And you could add a number of intersections, right? It could go on forever. But when she talked about black women, what she got interested in, so she has a legal background, was the fact that people who were wanting to file cases of discrimination were forced to choose whether they were being discriminated for being black or for being a woman. But that the reality for black women is that sometimes those overlapped. And you know what the court said? No. They said they can't file under both because that would give them 2 shots at the bat, and that's not fair. And so what she started looking at was the fact, though, that particularly black women had different issues than black men and white women, right? And then when they were looking at access to jobs, when they were looking at sexual harassment, when they were looking at these issues, it was different in this intersection, right? So as we start to think about these intersections and how they play out in our lives, and we start to expand that in different ways, we can talk about the fact that there was a police officer in New Mexico who was arrested for sexual assault. He was arrested for sexual assault, and he had actually sexually assaulted 13 women over the course of 10 years. It's a lot, right? When they took a look at the women that he was sexually assaulting, and this was Kimberly Crenshaw, again, who did this research, they were all women of color. They were all from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Many of them were involved with illegal activity. A lot of them were involved in the sex trade. He was very carefully targeting people in those intersections because he knew they didn't have access to resources. What were they going to do to stop him? They were powerless, right? So when we think about how those identities intersect and how those parts and pieces of ourselves get washed away and how sometimes they cause us to feel more oppressed or shift in different ways, it's really important to recognize that the parts you see of a person might not be all the parts and pieces that are there, right? So when people are coming into our dialogues, we might come in thinking they want to talk about race, but maybe they want to talk about what it's like to be black and queer. Maybe they're wanting to talk about what it's like to be from China and be out, right? Maybe they want to talk about what it's like to be born in another country, but to live here, be identified as something you don't identify with. I've worked with a lot of students who were Afro-Caribbean, and they didn't like being called African-American because they're like, I don't have the same experience as an African-American, but people just call me Black or Afro-Caribbean, and they don't understand my background. So we have to be willing to understand the intersections and listen to the parts and pieces. So what I want us to do now is to create some common language where we talk about our identities. And so there should be Post-it notes around the tables. If you need more Post-it notes, I also have Post-it notes up here. And so I want you to take a look at these giant Post-it notes on the wall, and I have some up here. If you think of another one, I have more Post-it notes we can bring up from over here and put up on the walls. And what I want you to do, if you identify with the group, is to write something about how you feel about the identifier, what it means for you, what you want other people to know. Just write something about what it means to identify with that group. And you don't have to identify with any group you don't feel comfortable identifying with, okay? If you don't identify with the group, I want you to write something about, that you know about, that you need to know about, that you have experienced, something in your cultural programming. I want you to write something. I want there to be a Post-it note from every person on every stick, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and do that now. I'm gonna leave this up here so that you can also take a look at these as you're writing your Post-it notes so you don't have to get up 27 times if you don't want to, okay? Looks like we have a couple people still working. more time. All right, so we just have a couple more? Okay. Is everyone comfortable with me taking some pictures that might end up on our website? I don't want anyone to be photographed if they don't want to be photographed. Okay. When you're used to working in queer spaces, you're used to asking if people want to be photographed. You never want to accidentally out somebody. All right, are only the people up, the people still working? Do you have anybody sitting down and still working? We have 6 people who couldn't be here today, and then we're recruiting through the summer. So yeah, but we have 4 students who are studying abroad, 1 person who had a prior engagement, and 1 person who had a medical situation. So. Okay, so it looks like we're almost done. Is that your last one?
I have one more.
One more? Okay. All right, so what I need is some volunteers who would be willing to come up and take one of the sheets and just take a look at them really quick and pick out a couple that stand out to you, okay? Because we don't have time to read through all of these, right? But if you have one that you feel particularly drawn to, you don't have to identify with the group, but make your way to one of the Post-it notes, the giant Post-it notes, and pick out a couple that you would like to share with us as a group. This is the last one that's getting finished, so all the other ones are ready to go. And once you have yours, if you'll make your way towards the front of the room, kind of along this table. also have ethnicity over here. Would anyone like to take ethnicity? Okay. You're just gonna pick out no more than 3 that you'd like to share to give us a broad spectrum of how people are thinking about these topics. And so our first one up is ability.
Sorry.
Oh,
Can I shift you over?
I haven't picked them yet.
Oh, you haven't picked them yet? Who's picked theirs? Sorry, I didn't mean to touch you. Who's already got some ready that they want to share? You want to go ahead and share? So what one do you have?
I have immigration status.
Immigration. Do you mind stepping a little closer to the microphone?
Yes. Yeah, so one person said many times immigration status is invisible, so be careful of what you say because you never know who will personally be affected. Thought that was interesting. Someone said they're an American citizen and doesn't understand what it's like to fear deportation. Someone is a permanent resident, so they're a green card holder, and it doesn't really affect them every day at the moment, but it is about to in the future. And I'm assuming they're talking about the administration.
Okay.
Was that- okay.
Yeah, so
Should I mention
broad
that?
spectrum of identity is there, right? And different lived experience when it comes to immigration status. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take pictures of all of these so that you can all read all of them. We just don't have time to go through each of them. So who has the next one they wanna come forward with?
I'll go. I have ability. The ones that stuck out to me was I feel like I'm not valued when I don't have access. Mental disability is important just as physical disabilities are too. And like a question, how ability affects our understanding of academic performance.
It's a really interesting question, right? So as we think about academic performance and we think about people with learning disabilities, people who lack access, people who have mental or psychological disabilities, and how that affects their ability to make it out to class. Next.
Okay, I had location of origin, region, or nation. And one of the ones I found interesting was where are you from implies something for some people, but it's not always straightforward. I thought that was interesting because there's actually 3 different Post-it notes that address the question, where are you from, and how they feel about it. And then one that says, being from Appalachia means no one can identify with my experiences. It can be lonely. And forgive my pronunciation, Chengdu, Southern Sichuan in China. And he also wrote that it's Peter Chang. It's all about the Sichuan dishes.
And so that question, where are you from? Why is that a volatile question? Anyone can answer. I'm not asking anyone specifics.
Well, I can say, like, I was one of the Post-it notes that said that question, just because me personally, I've grown up in 8 different houses throughout my life, and it's all over the country and across the world. And so when people say, where are you from? It's like, well, do you mean where I live now, where I lived the longest, where my favorite place to live was, where I have the best memories? It means like a lot of different things for all the different places that I've been.
Anybody else have a take on that? Where are you from?
I think also it's asked of minorities, especially when you're like the children of immigrants, and so you are from the U.S. versus your family came from somewhere else. So
Yeah.
I don't know, it depends.
It's the concept of the perpetual foreigner. We see it especially with Hispanic Latino people and with APIA folks, is this idea of where are you from? No, where are you really from? And that can be really frustrating, right? No, I'm from North Carolina or something like that. It's very frustrating. All right, who wants to go next? Thank you.
I have religion, and the 3 I picked is one says, my family will never accept my religion, it's a secret. The second one says, while I respect other people's religious identities and go out of my way to learn about them, I don't appreciate being pressured or assumed to be religious. And the third one says, I'm questioning my faith and I'm trying to figure it out within a fellowship group on campus, but I love their support in my spiritual journey.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so religion for a lot of people is a journey. This is the time where people are exploring and they want to have open dialogue about it. They want to be able to figure things out with others. All right.
So I have veteran status, and there's the majority of them are something along the lines of don't know much about veteran status, would like to know more about intersection with other disabilities, or not disabilities, sorry, with mental/physical ability. And then the majority, there's only really two categories. It's either they don't know and they'd like to know more, or they're related to someone who's in the military or was in the military. And sometimes they have complicated relationships about the government with that person, I suppose. That's what it looks like.
Thank you. Yeah, and there's a lot of misconceptions that all veterans have disabilities, and particularly that all veterans have PTSD. And the number of veterans who have PTSD is only slightly higher than in the general population. Random fact. I used to work at a school that served a lot of veterans.
I grabbed race, and I chose that one because there's a really interesting question on the front. It says, if my race does not match my perceived ethnicity, where do I fit? I thought that was really interesting. Some of the things put on it are, sometimes I'm hyper aware of my race and afraid that that's all people see of me. Another one was, as a Black woman, I don't enjoy being the representative of my race. And then the last one was, I have a lot of white guilt.
I have a lot of white guilt. How many people struggle with white guilt? It's okay to admit you struggle with white guilt. How many people know what white guilt is? You know?
I don't understand things privilege, so it's kind of hard to navigate, like, what am I doing is because of my white privilege and what am I doing for
It's just lunch. Nobody panic. In fact, everyone just get excited because it's almost lunch. Okay.
Okay, so I picked gender expression, and there seemed to be a couple, common themes. There was the theme of, people being aware of, problems that we have with perception of other people's gender expression and, wanting to do better with, respecting people's identities and not making assumptions. So, yeah, so one says, I'm still struggling to not assume gender identity based on presentation, but being here has dramatically shifted my knowledge. And then there were some questions. So there's a question that says, what's the difference between queer/non-binary and transgender/transsexual? And then there's one that says, I'm a female but like to wear men's clothing.
So it sounds like there's a lot of learning, but you still want to know more. For those of you who asked questions, if you want to, I'm comfortable answering questions that I associate with, so you can feel free to grab me at lunch and I would be happy to answer questions for you. Go ahead.
Okay, so I chose spoken language, and one of the ones I found interesting was, my father speaks Spanish and grew up in a Spanish-speaking country, but refused to teach his children because he wanted us to be more American. And so I thought that was interesting. That's kind of a theme throughout some of them, where people grew up in a household where there was another language, but they were taught to speak only English to seem more American. And then another one that I found interesting was, speak unaccented English and have never worried about the way I sound in classrooms in the US. And I think that just kind of speaks to how native English speakers who only speak English don't really realize the other struggles that may go into not having that as your first language.
Yeah, and remember how I said that oftentimes with these, when it comes to power and privilege, right, that you're forced to choose parts and pieces of yourself. And for many people who English is not their first language, when they move here, they feel like they have to assimilate. And so for many of them, they don't want their children to learn another language. My godmother is from the Philippines, and my godsister does not know Tagalog because her mother wanted her to assimilate. She wanted her to be an American. And so she doesn't know anything about Filipino culture or anything, and it's heartbreaking for her now because she feels so disconnected from who she is.
I got sexuality.
And 3, I find very interesting and have strong feelings about is the first one is asexuality. It exists. Please don't just assume everyone's straight. Yeah, and 2 of my good friends are also asexuality. That's the first time I hear these words, but after talking with them, I felt it's just kind of normal, and but people have some weird feelings about that. I think it should be more normal terms. And the second one is I hate how on surveys that ask to put your sexuality. What if you don't know or don't want to identify as one category? Yeah, because on my psych class, I was asked to do lots of psych services, and each one it has these questions, and sometimes I feel it's kind of awkward and weird because I think every people have both sides, either you are straight or you're not, but if just that is that part is stimulated by anyone you met, so I really like it. And another one is being bisexual and getting asked by friends which gender I prefer. One of my best friends took a survey and she wrote bi, and after her boyfriend knew that, he was very angry. He's like, are you really a bi? So how about me, like that? But I think it's kind of a good thing that she realized that she also may have this potential side and recognize and accept this side of her. And I think she's very brave, and we should also recognize if there are other sides of ourselves that is not exposed or hasn't been perceived yet.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of myths and stereotypes about bisexuals, and I originally came out as a bisexual person, and I remember people asking me, what percentage men and what percentage women? I'd be like, I don't think it works that way. Next.
I had gender, and there's an interesting range, I think. So there's a couple that talk about how sexism, or this one says sexism is one of the strongest forces of oppression in my life, but then there's also one that says being a woman is not a huge part of my identity. I would probably live the same life or relatively the same if I was male, which I think is interesting. And then someone else noticed that all of the students that came today are women, or appear to be women.
I was told when I took this job that we have predominantly women who come forward to do this work, and in general, people who identify as women or femmes are more likely to be involved in social justice work. And how do we start working to bring men who are most privileged people into the conversation?
Sorry. So I have class, and a lot of it was talking about experiences growing up in a middle class background, but there were a few that were really interesting. One of the most frustrating things about coming to William & Mary was people assuming my financial background based on where I live. And then growing up poor and being middle class means I feel like I don't fit in either world. And then talking about how I am from an upper middle class family and have never had to worry about finances. My parents are dealing with my college tuition.
We have quite a spectrum in the room.
I had ethnicity, and one of them says, I am half Turkish. I have been told I don't look Turkish and that I'm not Turkish enough. Another that was interesting was not having an accent does not make me American born. And the last one, I am Nepali, parents are from Nepal, and very proud of the fact. I wish people wouldn't assume my ethnicity.
So ethnicity is one of those things that can be very, very tricky, because you can't always see it, right? How many people heard the term transracial when Rachel Dolezal came forward with her foolery? The problem with that is not only that it's horrifyingly disgusting, but that it's actually a term that already exists. Transracial is a term that is used to identify people who were adopted by people of a different racial or cultural background than they have. So for example, a Chinese person who is adopted by white parents, a white child who's adopted by black parents, they have a different ethnicity than their race. They were raised in a different culture, and those two things don't line up for them. And so ethnicity can be different than we think it is, right? And so we had a lot today, right? We went through a lot of information this morning. The morning is the information-heavy sessions. We're going to talk a little bit about this later today. But I want us to think about this quote for a minute. It takes courage to interrogate yourself. It takes courage to look at the mirror and see past your reflection to who you really are when you take off the mask, when you're not performing the same old routines and social roles. It takes courage to ask, how did I become so well adjusted to injustice? So you have a reflection sheet. You don't have to fill out the whole sheet. It's in your package. It's just got some lines on it. But as I get the lunch set up, I want you to just reflect on what we've talked about this morning, what you've learned, questions that you have, and to reflect a little bit on the powers, privileges, or oppressions that you face every day. I want you to look into the mirror and have courage to address some of the things that we've talked about this morning, okay? And so that's it for this session, and I'm going to get your lunch ready, and I think you're all pretty excited about that. All right, thanks.